The year was 1095. Europe stood at a crossroads. For centuries, Christendom had been divided by wars, rivalries, and disputes. But beyond these conflicts lay a call that would change the destiny of nations. It began with the Byzantine Empire. The once mighty Eastern Roman state was under siege. Turkish forces had advanced into Asia Minor. Cities had fallen, armies had been defeated, and Constantinople itself trembled in fear. The Byzantine Emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, sought help. He looked westward, towards his estranged Christian brothers. Though divided by language, culture, and centuries of mistrust, he hoped for aid. And so, envoys were sent to the west, bearing urgent pleas for assistance. These pleas reached the ears of Pope Urban II, a man of vision, power, and deep conviction. He saw not only the suffering of Eastern Christians, but also the opportunity. An opportunity to unite Christendom under a single cause. The Pope called a great council. It was held at Clermont in France in November of 1095. Bishops, priests, nobles, and knights gathered. They did not yet know the fire that was about to be lit. Pope Urban rose before the assembly. His words were fierce, passionate, and filled with divine urgency. He spoke of the Holy Land. He told of Jerusalem, the city of Christ, now in the hands of unbelievers. He described pilgrims robbed, tortured, and slain. He told of desecrated holy places and of Christian brothers suffering under Muslim rule. The crowd listened in silence. The weight of his words pressed upon their hearts. Urban's voice rose, and he declared a holy mission. He proclaimed that Christ himself commanded it. Deus vult, God wills it. The words rang out from the assembly. One by one, voices joined the cry. Soon, the entire field thundered with the chant. Deus vult, Deus vult, Deus vult. The Pope promised forgiveness of sins. He promised salvation to all who would take the cross. He declared that those who fought for Christ would be soldiers of God, that their swords would not shed mortal blood alone, but would defend the eternal faith. The response was overwhelming. Knights stepped forward, eager to pledge themselves. Peasants, priests, and nobles alike fell to their knees. They sewed crosses onto their garments. They vowed to march eastward, to liberate Jerusalem. The idea spread like wildfire. Messengers carried the call throughout France, Germany, and beyond. From castles to villages, the word of the crusade inspired thousands. Men sold their lands, abandoned their homes, and prepared for the journey. But not all joined for faith alone. Some sought wealth, others adventure, and some redemption. The crusade promised all these things. Yet, above all, it promised glory in the service of God. In the months that followed, armies began to gather. The great lords of Europe swore their loyalty to the cause. Men like Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, and Bohemond of Taranto, each powerful, each ambitious, and each ready to bear the cross. But it was not only knights. Tens of thousands of peasants also answered the call. Led by preachers like Peter the Hermit, they marched without discipline or preparation. This would become the People's Crusade, a movement of zeal, but also tragedy. Europe was transformed. For the first time, men from across Christendom united under one banner, the banner of the cross. The Pope's words had done what kings and emperors had failed to achieve. He had united the West. The journey would be long, the road filled with hunger, hardship, and blood. Yet nothing could stop the tide that had begun. The crusade was no longer just an idea. It was a holy storm sweeping across Europe, destined for the East. And so, with cries of Deus Vult echoing through the land, the First Crusade had begun. The year was 1096. The Pope's call had spread across Europe like fire on dry grass. Every village, every castle, every monastery echoed with the cry, Deus Vult. God wills it. Knights prepared their armor. Peasants gathered what little they had. Priests blessed the journey, calling it a pilgrimage of the sword. The world of Christendom was in motion. But the first to answer were not great lords. They were the poor, the desperate, and the faithful. Led by fiery preachers such as Peter the Hermit. This became known as the People's Crusade. Men, women, and even children took up the cross. They believed God Himself would guide their steps. With no training, little food, and no discipline, they marched east. Their hearts burned with zeal, but their bodies were unprepared. The roads through Europe became rivers of pilgrims. Fields were emptied. Villages abandoned. Entire families walked together toward the unknown. As they marched, tensions grew. Supplies ran short. Hungry and desperate, some groups turned violent. Tragically, Jewish communities across the Rhineland were attacked. Thousands were slaughtered in massacres fueled by misguided zeal. The crusade had already begun to spill innocent blood. When these groups finally reached Byzantine lands, the Emperor Alexios was shocked. He had asked for knights, disciplined warriors. Instead, he found a starving, unruly mob. Still, he provided them passage across the Bosporus, hoping they might at least harass the enemy. But the People's Crusade met disaster. They rushed into Turkish territory without order or caution. There, near Civito, they were ambushed and destroyed. The people's crusade ended in fire and blood. Yet the true crusade had not yet begun. For behind them came the armies of the great lords, the princes of Christendom, knights in shining mail, hardened by war, riding beneath banners of the cross. Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, a pious and respected knight, chosen by many as leader. Raymond of Toulouse, wealthy and powerful, bringing thousands with him. Bohemond of Taranto, a cunning Norman, bold and ambitious. And Hugh of Vermandois, brother to the King of France. Each man carried his own dreams, but all swore loyalty to the cross. The journey was immense. Armies marched through the heart of Europe, crossing rivers, climbing mountains, and enduring endless hardships. Food grew scarce. Disease spread through the camps. Yet the vision of Jerusalem pulled them ever forward. When they reached Constantinople, the Emperor Alexios greeted them cautiously. He admired their strength, but he feared their ambition. To secure his empire, he demanded oaths of loyalty. He asked that any lands recovered, once part of Byzantium, be returned to him. The lords reluctantly agreed. Each swore fealty, though some whispered they would not keep their promises. And so, ferried across the Bosporus, the Crusader armies set foot in Asia Minor. The Holy War had truly begun. Their first great challenge was the city of Nicaea, once Byzantine, now held by the Turks. The Crusaders surrounded the walls. Siege engines were built, towers raised, and the battle commenced. For weeks, arrows rained down. The clash of steel and the roar of battle filled the air. But in secret, the city negotiated with the Byzantines. Before the Crusaders could storm the gates, Nicaea surrendered to Alexios. This angered many knights, who felt robbed of their rightful prize. Still, the march continued. Through the burning heat of summer, through hostile lands filled with Turkish horsemen. Every step was paid for with blood. At Dorylaeum, the Crusaders faced their greatest trial yet. The Turkish Sultan Kilij Arslan struck with all his might. Swift horse archers surrounded the Crusaders. Arrows darkened the sky. Knights were cut down in chaos. For hours, the Crusaders fought desperately. Shields splintered, men fell, and the battle seemed lost. But then, reinforcements arrived. Bohemond held firm, while Godfrey and Raymond struck the Turks from the rear. The tide turned. The Turks fled, and the Crusaders claimed victory. The road to the Holy Land was open. But it was only the beginning. Ahead lay hunger, thirst, betrayal, and unimaginable struggle. Yet the cross led them ever forward, toward Antioch and beyond, toward Jerusalem. The first crusade had truly begun. The Crusaders marched south after their victory at Dorylaeum. Their spirits were high, but their bodies were weary. Every step forward brought them deeper into hostile lands. Ahead lay one of the greatest challenges of the entire crusade: the mighty city of Antioch. Antioch was no ordinary fortress. It was a city of immense size, surrounded by towering walls. Its defenses stretched for miles, guarded by hundreds of towers. Some said its walls could rival those of Constantinople itself. To take Antioch would mean controlling the gateway to Syria. Without Antioch, the road to Jerusalem was blocked. In October of 1097, the Crusaders reached the city. They saw its walls rising like mountains, and they knew this would not be an easy task. The siege of Antioch had begun. The Crusaders encircled the city, but their numbers were too few to seal it completely. Supplies flowed in and out through hidden paths. The defenders mocked the Crusaders from the towers, shouting insults, beating drums, and firing arrows. As weeks passed, hunger began to gnaw at the Crusaders. Food grew scarce, horses died, and many knights were forced to fight on foot. Some Crusaders even resorted to eating grass, leather, and the flesh of their enemies. The Holy Army was suffering. Inside Antioch, the defenders endured hardship as well. But they were supplied by allies from the east. The siege dragged on through winter. Cold winds cut through tents, and disease spread in the camps. Morale began to falter. Some knights deserted. Others questioned whether God had abandoned them. But the leaders held firm. Godfrey, Raymond, Bohemond, and the others swore they would not retreat. Bohemond of Taranto saw an opportunity. He whispered to the other lords, "If Antioch falls, I should rule it, for it will be my prize." The others resisted, but desperation made them listen. Bohemond promised to find a way into the city, and indeed, he did. A secret pact was made with a guard inside the city, a tower commander named Firuz, who had grown weary of his masters. In exchange for gold and promises of favor, Firuz agreed to open a gate. On the night of June 2nd, 1098, the plan was set in motion. Under cover of darkness, Bohemond led a band of knights. They scaled the walls with ladders, guided by Firuz. One by one, Crusaders slipped into the sleeping city. Suddenly, the gates were thrown open. The Crusader army poured in. The streets of Antioch erupted in chaos. The defenders fought desperately, but they were overwhelmed. By dawn, the city was in Crusader hands. But victory came at a price. For even as the Crusaders celebrated, a new danger approached. The mighty Muslim general Kerboga of Mosul had arrived. He brought with him a vast army, far larger than the Crusaders. The hunters had become the hunted. Kerboga surrounded Antioch. Now the Crusaders, who had been besiegers, found themselves besieged, trapped inside the very city they had fought to take. Hunger returned, fiercer than ever. Disease ravaged the ranks. Some lords even considered surrender. But then came a miracle. A monk named Peter Bartholomew claimed he had visions of Saint Andrew. In his dreams, the saint revealed the location of the Holy Lance. The spear that had pierced the side of Christ on the cross. The Crusaders dug in the Cathedral of St. Peter. After hours of searching, they uncovered a lance head buried in the ground. To many, it was a sign from heaven, a divine promise of victory. Faith was renewed. Knights who had been weak with hunger now stood tall. Soldiers who had been ready to flee now burned with zeal. They believed God Himself had armed them. On June 28, 1098, the Crusaders marched out of Antioch. They faced Kerboga's massive army in the open field. The battle was fierce. The Turks rained arrows. Their cavalry thundered across the plain. But the Crusaders held the Holy Lance high. They charged with cries of Deus Vult. The Turks faltered. Disorder spread through their ranks. Soon, Kerboga's army broke and fled. The Crusaders had won. Against all odds, they had survived. Antioch was theirs. But their journey was far from over. Ahead still lay Jerusalem, the holy city, the ultimate prize. The road would be long, and the trials even greater. The siege of Antioch had tested their faith, their endurance, and their unity. It became a story of suffering and of miracles, and it would be remembered as one of the greatest struggles of the First Crusade. The Crusaders had endured hunger, disease, and endless battles. They had marched across strange lands, through snow and desert, over mountains and rivers. They had seen comrades die in countless numbers. And yet, their faith still burned with the promise of Jerusalem. By early June of 1099, their dream was within reach. The holy city stood before them. Jerusalem, the city of David, the city of Christ, the heart of the world. The sight filled the Crusaders with awe and trembling. Tears flowed, prayers rose, and knights fell to their knees. But the city was not theirs yet. Jerusalem was held by the Fatimid forces of Egypt. Its walls were high and strong, its defenders determined. The Crusaders knew that only through blood and fire would the city be taken. The siege began in June. At first, the Crusaders suffered. There was little food, even less water. The summer sun scorched the earth. Men collapsed under the burning heat. Some whispered that God had brought them so far only to let them perish at the gates of the holy city. But then, fortune turned. A fleet of Genoese ships landed at Jaffa, bringing wood, supplies, and skilled craftsmen. The Crusaders quickly built siege towers, ladders, and engines of war. The defenders responded with arrows, stones, and fire. Every day the sky was filled with smoke and dust. Every night the hills echoed with the sound of hammering and prayers. On July 13th, the final assault began. The Crusaders rolled their towers to the walls. Arrows darkened the sky. The clash of steel, the cries of the wounded, the roar of drums filled the air. The defenders fought with fury. Boiling oil and fire were hurled down from above. The Crusaders pushed forward with ladders and rams. On the morning of July 15th, a breach was made. Godfrey of Bouillon led the assault. He ordered his tower moved close to the northern walls. From there, his men stormed the battlements. After hours of brutal fighting, the Crusaders gained the walls. The defenders fell back. Panic spread inside the city. Soon, the Crusaders flooded through the gates. Jerusalem was theirs. The holy city had fallen. But what followed was a storm of blood. The Crusaders, overcome with rage and zeal, unleashed terror. They killed soldiers, civilians, men, women, and children. Blood flowed in the streets. The mosques were filled with the dead. It was said that the streets of Jerusalem ran ankle-deep in blood. In the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Crusaders gathered. They wept, they prayed, they sang hymns. To them, it was not slaughter, but holy purification. They believed God had given them victory. Godfrey of Bouillon was declared the ruler of Jerusalem, but he refused the title of king. Instead, he called himself Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. He claimed no crown of gold could compare to the crown of thorns worn by Christ. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves across the world. To the Christians of Europe, it was the greatest triumph. The holy goal of the First Crusade had been achieved. Pilgrims rejoiced, churches rang their bells, and bards sang of heroes. But to the Muslim world, it was a tragedy. A wound that would never be forgotten. A call for vengeance that would echo through the centuries. The First Crusade had ended, but the story of the Crusades had only just begun. The fall of Jerusalem would ignite centuries of war, faith, and blood. A cycle of conquest and resistance. A story that would shape the destiny of East and West. The First Crusade had achieved what many believed was impossible. Against all odds, a band of knights, peasants, and pilgrims carved a kingdom out of the Holy Land. From the ashes of conquest, a fragile new order began to emerge. The city of Jerusalem, the jewel of the Crusaders' victory, was declared the capital of a new kingdom. It was called the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, a realm forged by faith, ambition, and the sword. This kingdom, though small and fragile, stood as a symbol of triumph for Christendom. But Jerusalem was not the only Crusader state to rise. Along the Mediterranean coast and beyond, the conquerors established 4 principal domains. These were the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. Together, they were known as the Crusader states. The rulers of these states came not as natives, but as foreign lords. They brought with them the feudal traditions of Europe. Castles rose across the landscape, fortresses of stone designed to guard their hold. From Crac des Chevaliers in Syria to the mighty walls of Jerusalem, their architecture spoke of power and fear. Yet the Crusaders were few in number. Surrounded by vast Muslim populations, they relied on fortifications, alliances, and the flow of reinforcements from Europe. Every knight was precious, every soldier counted. They were an island of Latin Christianity in a sea of Islamic empires. Life in the Crusader states was not simple. Trade routes flourished, bringing spices, silks, and ideas from the East. Markets bustled with goods from across the Mediterranean and beyond. European settlers mingled with local Christians, Armenians, Syrians, and even some Muslims who lived under Crusader rule. The Latin rulers imposed their authority with strict control, but necessity forced them into diplomacy. They made treaties with neighboring Muslim rulers when war was too costly. They intermarried with local nobles to secure alliances. Thus, the Crusader states became a strange blend of East and West. The Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem itself stretched only as far as its armies could defend. At its heart was the Holy City, revered as the place of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. Pilgrims came from across Europe, their journeys protected by the knights. The Hospitallers and Templars, 2 great military orders, rose during this time. These warrior monks took vows of poverty and faith, yet fought with unmatched discipline. The Crusader states, however, were never secure. The county of Edessa lay vulnerable to attacks from the east. The Principality of Antioch clashed with neighboring powers. Jerusalem itself, though glorious, was a beacon that drew the ambitions of every Muslim leader. For a time, the Crusaders held firm. Their castles stood strong. Their knights rode with pride. But the storm clouds were already gathering. The Muslim world, once divided, was beginning to awaken. From the deserts and cities of the Middle East, new leaders were rising. They would soon challenge the Latin kingdom with a force that could not be ignored. The Crusader states, fragile yet determined, stood at the edge of a new and perilous age. The Latin kingdom of Jerusalem and its sister states had survived their birth. But survival was never guaranteed. In the east, new threats were stirring. The county of Edessa, the most vulnerable of all Crusader states, was the first to fall. In 1144, the powerful Muslim leader Zengi captured Edessa. The loss sent shockwaves through Christendom. For the first time since the Crusaders had arrived, one of their hard-won states had been erased. The news of Edessa's fall spread quickly to Europe. Church leaders and kings alike trembled at the thought of the Holy Land collapsing. Once more the call to arms was sounded. This time it was louder, broader, and more ambitious than before. Pope Eugenius III issued a papal bull urging Christians to take up the cross. The fiery preacher, Bernard of Clairvaux, carried the message across Europe. Crowds filled with peasants, knights, and nobles swore oaths to march. But unlike the First Crusade, this new campaign would not be led by wandering lords. It would be led by kings. Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany took the cross. Their commitment gave the Second Crusade unprecedented weight. Two of the greatest monarchs of Europe would now march east in the name of Christ. The journey, however, was plagued with disaster. The German army under Conrad was ambushed in Anatolia. Starvation, exhaustion, and constant raids bled their strength. By the time they reached the Holy Land, their forces were shattered. The French fared little better. Marching through the Byzantine Empire, they faced suspicion and betrayal. In Anatolia, they too were harassed and cut down by Turkish attacks. The great host that had set out from Europe arrived in the Levant weakened and demoralized. Once in the Holy Land, the Crusaders debated their next move. Instead of striking to reclaim Edessa, they set their sights on Damascus. Damascus was a powerful city, wealthy and strategically vital. If captured, it would strengthen Jerusalem and secure the Crusaders' position. In 1148, the Second Crusade launched its grand assault on Damascus. At first, victory seemed possible. But divisions within the Crusader leadership soon tore their unity apart. Allies quarreled, supplies dwindled, and the siege collapsed. The Crusaders retreated in humiliation. Their dream of conquest had ended in failure. Edessa was lost forever. Damascus remained strong in Muslim hands. The failure of the Second Crusade sent shockwaves through Europe. For the first time, Christendom had poured its might into the East and achieved nothing. The aura of divine destiny that had surrounded the First Crusade was shattered. Meanwhile, in the Muslim world, leaders gained confidence. They saw that the Crusaders could be defeated. The balance of power was beginning to shift. Soon a new champion would rise among the Muslims. His name would echo through history, Saladin. In the wake of the failed Second Crusade, the Muslim world began to find unity. Where once rival emirs and sultans had fought each other, now a new vision began to emerge. At the heart of this vision stood one man, Salah ad-Din, known in the West as Saladin. Saladin was born in 1137 in Tikrit, on the banks of the Tigris River. He was not from a powerful royal family, but his Kurdish lineage and disciplined upbringing gave him strength. As a young man, he served under his uncle Shirkuh, a brilliant general in the service of Nur ad-Din, ruler of Aleppo. Under Shirkuh and Nur ad-Din, Saladin learned the art of war. He studied strategy, diplomacy, and faith. Unlike many leaders of his time, Saladin was deeply religious, humble, and generous. But he was also fiercely ambitious. In 1169, Saladin's destiny changed forever. Shirkuh died suddenly after becoming vizier of Egypt. The post fell to Saladin, who quickly consolidated power. Though young, he displayed wisdom beyond his years. He secured Egypt, reorganized its army, and ensured loyalty to Nur ad-Din. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, Saladin moved swiftly. He brought Syria under his control, uniting it with Egypt. For the first time in decades, vast Muslim lands were united under a single ruler. The Crusader states, once surrounded by division, now faced a growing empire. Saladin ruled with justice and fairness. He lowered taxes for peasants, built schools, and supported scholars. His character earned him respect, not only from Muslims, but even from his Christian enemies. Chroniclers described him as merciful, honorable, and unlike any ruler of the age. But Saladin's ultimate goal was clear. He sought the liberation of Jerusalem. The holy city, captured by the Crusaders in 1099, was the heart of his mission. To achieve this, he needed patience, strength, and unity. Throughout the 11th century, Saladin expanded his territory. He secured Damascus, Aleppo, and Mosul. His power stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates. The Crusaders watched in fear as his shadow grew longer. Yet Saladin did not rush into war. He strengthened his armies, built alliances, and prepared for the great struggle. He fought smaller battles, testing the Crusaders' defenses. Slowly, he encircled the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. By the 11th century, Saladin was the undisputed leader of the Muslim world. He commanded vast armies and loyal emirs. His name inspired devotion among his followers and terror in the hearts of his enemies. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the Holy Land. A clash between the united forces of Islam and the Crusader kingdoms. Saladin was ready, and soon he would strike. By the summer of 1187, Saladin was ready to confront the Crusader states. For years, he had prepared his armies, united Muslim lands, and waited for the right moment. Now, the time had come. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem was divided and weakened. Its leaders argued among themselves, and their greed often outweighed their wisdom. One man in particular fueled the conflict, Reynald of Châtillon. A reckless Crusader lord, Reynald had repeatedly attacked Muslim caravans, even during times of truce. His arrogance enraged Saladin and gave him the excuse he needed for war. Saladin declared jihad and gathered his forces. From Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia, soldiers rallied under his banner. The largest Muslim army in decades now marched toward the Crusaders. In July 1187, the Crusader kings and knights assembled their own army. Led by King Guy of Lusignan, they decided to strike first. Against the advice of some, they marched across the dry, hot plains of Galilee. Their goal was to break Saladin's siege of Tiberias. But Saladin had carefully planned the battlefield. His forces controlled the wells and springs. The Crusaders marched under the burning sun with little water. Their heavy armor weighed them down, and thirst began to consume them. On July 4th, the two armies clashed near the twin hills, known as the Horns of Hattin. Saladin's troops surrounded the Crusaders, cutting off their escape. Arrows rained down upon them, while smoke from burning grass choked their ranks. The heat, the thirst, and the relentless attacks broke the Crusaders' strength. By midday, their army collapsed. Knights fell to the ground, unable to fight. The true cross, the most sacred relic of the Crusaders, was captured by Saladin's men. King Guy himself was taken prisoner. Reynald of Châtillon was brought before Saladin. Saladin, merciful to most prisoners, showed no mercy to Reynald. He personally struck him down, ending the man who had defied truces and desecrated peace. To others, Saladin granted water, food, and mercy. His reputation for honor grew even greater. The Battle of Hattin was a turning point. The Crusader army was destroyed. The road to Jerusalem now lay open. Saladin's dream was within reach. The fall of the Crusaders at Hattin sent shockwaves across Europe. Pope and kings trembled at the news. The Latin kingdom of Jerusalem stood on the brink of collapse, and Saladin prepared for the greatest victory of his life. After the crushing defeat at Hattin, the Crusader kingdom was broken. Cities and castles surrendered one after another. Saladin's army swept across the land, unstoppable in its advance. By late September 1187, Saladin's forces reached the walls of Jerusalem. The holy city, heart of both faith and history, now stood vulnerable. For nearly a century, it had been in Crusader hands. But now, it was surrounded by Saladin's banners. Inside the city, fear spread among the people. Pilgrims, knights, and families crowded the churches, praying for deliverance. The defenders were few, exhausted, and without hope of relief. King Guy was a prisoner, and most of the Crusader lords were gone. The fate of Jerusalem lay in the hands of Balian of Ibelin. Balian, though weary, became the leader of the city. He rallied the knights who remained. He armed even common citizens, men who had never held a sword. With courage, he promised to fight for every stone of the city. Saladin sent messengers offering surrender. He wished to take the city without bloodshed. But Balian asked for terms to protect the people. Negotiations faltered, and battle began. The siege was fierce. Muslim siege engines hurled stones against the walls. Archers darkened the skies with arrows. The defenders fought desperately, repelling wave after wave. But the walls of Jerusalem could not hold forever. Saladin's forces breached the defenses. The city, sacred to three faiths, lay open before him. Unlike the massacre of 1099, when Crusaders had taken Jerusalem, Saladin showed restraint. He forbade slaughter. Instead, he offered terms of ransom. Those who could pay were allowed to leave safely. The poor and helpless were eventually freed by his mercy. On October 2nd, 1187, Jerusalem surrendered. Muslim soldiers raised their banners upon the holy walls. The dome of the rock was purified. The call to prayer once again echoed over the city. For Muslims, it was a day of triumph. For Christians, a day of sorrow. News of the city's fall spread quickly across Europe. Kings and popes trembled. The Third Crusade was now inevitable. The world had changed. The heart of the Crusader dream was gone. And Saladin stood as the hero of the age. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 shook the Christian world. Church bells tolled across Europe, not in celebration, but in mourning. Pope Gregory VIII issued a call for a new crusade. This would become the Third Crusade, perhaps the most famous of them all. 3 mighty kings answered the call: Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor. Each brought power, armies, and the weight of kingdoms. Frederick Barbarossa led his army first. Tens of thousands marched with him through Anatolia. But fate was cruel. In 1190, Frederick drowned while crossing a river. His army scattered. One great hope of Christendom was lost. Richard and Philip set out by sea. They stopped first at Sicily, where tensions quickly rose. Then, in Cyprus, Richard showed his strength. He captured the island, securing it as a crusader base. By 1191, Richard and Philip reached the Holy Land. The Crusader army laid siege to the great port city of Acre. For 2 long years, Muslims and Crusaders fought over its walls. Starvation, disease, and endless battle consumed both sides. Finally, in July 1191, Acre surrendered. The Crusaders entered triumphantly. But quarrels soon broke out. Philip returned to France, leaving Richard to face Saladin alone. Richard the Lionheart proved himself a brilliant commander. At the Battle of Arsuf, he led the Crusaders to a decisive victory. Saladin's forces, though brave, were forced to retreat. The reputation of Richard grew, his courage admired even by his enemies. Yet the holy city remained beyond reach. For years, Richard and Saladin fought in a deadly game of siege and maneuver. Battles were won, castles taken, but Jerusalem stood firm. At last, in 1192, Richard and Saladin agreed to peace. The Treaty of Jaffa was signed. Christians would keep control of the coast. Pilgrims were allowed safe passage to Jerusalem. But the city itself remained in Muslim hands. Richard returned to Europe, his dream unfulfilled. Saladin remained the master of Jerusalem, respected even by his foes. The Third Crusade had not retaken the Holy City, but it had preserved a fragile balance and left behind legends of valor, honor, and rivalry. The story of Richard and Saladin would echo for centuries. A tale not just of war, but of respect between great leaders. The Third Crusade had reached its climax. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, but the Crusaders still held the coast. Both sides were weary of endless war. Richard the Lionheart knew he could not march to Jerusalem. His army was exhausted. Supplies were running low, and divisions among the Crusaders grew deeper each day. Saladin, too, felt the burden of years of conflict. His soldiers were tired, resources were strained, and the shadow of more crusades loomed over the horizon. Letters passed between Richard and Saladin. Messages carried by trusted envoys. Talks of peace began, cautious and slow. Each side sought to keep honor while ending bloodshed. Richard demanded that Christian pilgrims must have safe passage. He wanted the holy sites open for worship, and the security of coastal strongholds for the Crusaders. Saladin refused to surrender Jerusalem. The holy city would remain under Muslim rule. But he promised that pilgrims could enter without harm. Churches within the city would be respected. For weeks, negotiations continued. Threats of renewed battle hung in the air, but neither side wished to gamble further lives. Compromise became the path forward. In September 1192, the Treaty of Jaffa was signed. It marked a fragile peace. The coast from Jaffa to Acre would remain in Crusader hands. Jerusalem would stay with Saladin. Yet Christian pilgrims could freely visit the city. Richard and Saladin never met in person, but through their words, they showed mutual respect. Enemies in battle, they became almost equals in diplomacy. The truce brought relief to both lands. For the first time in years, swords were lowered, and weary people could breathe again. Richard prepared for his return to Europe. Saladin remained the guardian of Jerusalem. Neither had achieved complete victory, but both had won a measure of peace. The negotiations and truce became a lesson for future ages. That even in the fiercest wars, diplomacy could carve a fragile peace out of blood and fire. The dream of reclaiming the Holy Land did not die. Pope Innocent III called for a new crusade. The year was 1202, and once again, knights of Europe prepared to march. But this crusade would take a very different path. The warriors of Christendom gathered not in France, nor in England, but in Venice, the great maritime republic. The Venetians agreed to transport the Crusaders by sea. Their mighty fleet could carry tens of thousands, but the cost was immense, far more than the Crusaders could pay. The leaders of Venice proposed a deal. If the Crusaders helped capture the rebellious city of Zara, the Venetians would forgive much of the debt. The knights, desperate and bound by oath, agreed. In November 1202, the Crusaders attacked Zara, a Christian city, a city under the protection of the Pope. The assault shocked all of Christendom. Pope Innocent III was furious. he excommunicated the Crusaders and condemned the Venetians. But the march continued. Soon a new opportunity arose. The Crusaders were approached by a Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, son of a deposed emperor. He promised riches and aid if they restored him to power. The Crusaders saw their chance. With Venetian ships, they sailed to Constantinople, the greatest city of the East, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire. In 1203, they stormed its mighty walls. Alexios was crowned as emperor, but his promises of gold and supplies proved empty. Tensions grew between Crusaders and Byzantines. By April 1204, patience ran out. The Crusaders launched a full-scale attack on Constantinople. The walls fell. The city burned. For 3 days, the Crusaders looted and destroyed. Churches were desecrated, palaces plundered, and treasures carried off to Venice and the West. The Byzantine Empire was shattered. A Latin kingdom was established in Constantinople. But the Holy Land was forgotten. Jerusalem remained far away. The Fourth Crusade became one of history's darkest chapters. A holy mission corrupted by greed. Brothers in faith turned against one another. And the scars on Byzantium would never fully heal. The year was 1212. A strange and tragic tale began to unfold. Unlike the Crusades of knights and kings, this was a crusade of children. It began in France. A boy named Stephen of Cloyes claimed he had received a vision. He said that Christ himself had spoken to him and commanded him to lead a holy army. Stephen believed that only the innocence of children could succeed where the swords of knights had failed. He preached with fiery passion, and thousands of children gathered to follow him. Across the Rhine in Germany, another boy, Nicholas of Cologne, proclaimed a similar vision. He too believed the seas would part, and the children would march safely to the Holy Land. Word spread quickly. Villages emptied. Families wept as their sons and daughters departed, carrying crosses, banners, and unshakable faith. The children believed they would perform miracles. They believed the Mediterranean would open before them. As the Red Sea had once parted for Moses, and they would walk to Jerusalem untouched. But reality was harsh. The journey was long and merciless. Hunger gnawed at their small bodies. Disease spread through their ranks. Many perished along the way. Others deserted, returning home broken. But still, thousands pressed on. driven by the hope of divine salvation. When the children reached the ports of Marseilles and Genoa, they awaited the miracle. They prayed for the sea to part, but the waters remained still. Some children fell to their knees in despair. Others wept bitterly. But many still refused to give up. They searched for ships to carry them east. Merchants offered transport. They promised to take the children across the sea. But their promises were cruel lies. The children were sold into slavery instead. Some were taken to North Africa. Others vanished in the markets of the East. Few ever returned to their homes. The crusade of children ended in sorrow. Pope Innocent III, upon hearing the news, declared that the children's faith was purer than that of their elders. But faith alone could not change the world, and innocence was crushed under the weight of reality. The children's crusade became a warning, a story of blind zeal, of manipulation and betrayal, and of young souls lost to history. It showed that the dream of reclaiming the Holy Land had grown into something beyond reason, something that consumed not only kings and knights, but even the most vulnerable of society. The Children's Crusade stands as one of the most haunting chapters, not of victory, not of conquest, but of tragic innocence. The year was 1217. A new call for holy war echoed across Europe. The Pope and the clergy urged Christendom once again to reclaim Jerusalem and the Holy Land. But this time, the strategy was different. The Crusaders would strike not at Jerusalem directly. Instead, they would attack Egypt. For Egypt was the heart of Muslim power. If Egypt fell, the Muslims would be weakened, and Jerusalem would be left vulnerable. So the crusade began with hope and careful planning. Knights from Germany, Hungary, and Austria, alongside soldiers from Italy and France, gathered under the banner of the cross. They marched towards the Nile. The target was the great port city of Damietta, a fortress that guarded the entrance to Egypt. Tall walls, iron gates, and determined defenders stood ready to resist the Christian army. At first, the Crusaders fought bravely. They besieged the city with towers and catapults. Months turned into years. Hunger and disease struck both sides. But finally, in 1219, after a long and bitter struggle, Damietta fell into Crusader hands. The Christians rejoiced. They believed victory was near, They believed Cairo would soon be theirs, and from there, Jerusalem would be within reach. But pride clouded their judgment. The Muslims, under Sultan al-Kamil, nephew of the great Saladin, did not surrender. He offered peace. He even offered to return Jerusalem, but the Crusader leaders refused, blinded by ambition. They wanted Cairo, not just Jerusalem. They pressed forward into the Nile Delta. The land betrayed them. The Nile flooded. The Crusaders became trapped in the rising waters. Mud and swamps swallowed their strength. Disease spread. Food ran out. The once proud army of Christendom weakened until they could fight no more. In 1221, the Muslims struck back with force. The Crusaders, surrounded and desperate, had no choice but to surrender. Damietta, the prize they had fought so hard to win, was returned to the Muslims, and the Fifth Crusade ended in failure and humiliation. The dream of retaking Jerusalem once again slipped away. All the sacrifices, all the blood, all the hope vanished with the tides of the Nile. The Fifth Crusade became a lesson that greed and arrogance could destroy even the strongest armies, that diplomacy sometimes offers more than the sword, and that the Holy Land remained far beyond reach. The year was 1228. Europe was weary of war. The failures of past crusades weighed heavily. But still, the dream of Jerusalem lived on. This time, the leader was not a pope or a knightly king. It was the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, a man of ambition, intellect, and controversy. He had promised to lead a crusade. But delays and politics brought him into conflict with the Pope. Excommunication fell upon him. Yet he still sailed to the Holy Land. Unlike past crusaders, Frederick's approach was not through blood and steel, but through words and negotiation, through treaties instead of battle. When he arrived in Acre, he found a divided crusader state. Knights bickering, nobles suspicious. The once proud kingdom of Jerusalem was weak. But Frederick was clever. He opened secret talks with Sultan al-Kamil, the same ruler who had defeated the Fifth Crusade, and the nephew of Saladin. The Sultan was also burdened. Threats from rivals in Syria and Mesopotamia pressed him. He needed peace in the West. So, negotiations began. Months of careful diplomacy followed. No great battles shook the land. No catapults thundered against the walls. Instead, pens and promises forged the outcome. In 1229, the Treaty of Jaffa was signed. Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth were handed back to the Christians. The Holy City returned to Christian hands, not by sword, but by diplomacy. It was a triumph unlike any other. Yet it was fragile. The Muslims kept control of the Temple Mount, and the sacred mosques remained theirs. Jerusalem was divided in faith and spirit. Frederick II entered the Holy City, crowned himself King of Jerusalem, without the blessing of the Pope, without the cheers of united knights. His victory was hollow, for in Europe, the Pope still condemned him, and many Christians doubted his cause. But history remembers that the Sixth Crusade was won not by slaughter, but by strategy, not by force, but by diplomacy. It showed the world that sometimes peace could achieve what centuries of war could not. The year was 1248. Europe once again prepared for war. The dream of reclaiming the Holy Land still burned in the hearts of kings and knights. This time, the leader was none other than King Louis IX of France, a man of deep faith, a ruler later remembered as Saint Louis. For Louis, the crusade was not just politics. It was a sacred vow, a mission from God. But the target was not Jerusalem. It was Egypt, the gateway to the Muslim world, and the key to future conquest. In 1249, the Crusader fleet set sail. Thousands of ships filled the horizon, carrying knights, soldiers, priests, and dreams. They landed at Damietta, a port city on the Nile. The defenders fled before the Christian army. Victory seemed swift. Hope soared among the Crusaders. But Egypt was no easy prize. The Nile was a trap. Its floods, canals, and marshes slowed every advance. The land itself became the enemy. Louis pressed forward, seeking Cairo, the heart of Egypt, the jewel of the Sultanate. But the Muslims regrouped, led by the brilliant general Fakhr al-Din, and later by the mighty Mamluks. Warriors born in battle, masters of the sword. At the city of Mansoura, the Crusaders clashed with the Mamluks. Fierce street fighting erupted. Narrow alleys became rivers of blood. Louis's brother, Robert of Artois, led a reckless charge into the city. At first, the Christians gained ground. But soon they were trapped, and Robert fell with his knights. The Crusader army faltered. Disease swept through the camps. The Nile's waters turned against them. Supplies ran short. Then disaster struck. The Crusaders were surrounded, cut off from escape, and crushed by the relentless Mamluks. King Louis himself was captured. The mighty ruler of France, now a prisoner in chains. His army shattered, his crusade in ruins. Only after paying a massive ransom did Louis regain his freedom. But the Seventh Crusade ended in humiliation. Europe wept at the news. The Holy Land was still beyond their grasp, and Egypt had broken the Crusader dream. Yet Louis did not abandon his vow. He returned to France to rebuild his strength, already planning for another crusade. But the world had changed. The Muslim powers were growing stronger. The Mamluks were rising. And the age of easy victories was gone forever. The year was 1270. 2 decades had passed since the failure in Egypt. But King Louis IX of France had not abandoned his vow. For him, the Crusades were not just wars. They were a holy mission, a path to eternal salvation. Louis believed that Christendom still had one last chance to strike at the heart of Islam and reclaim the Holy Land. But instead of Jerusalem or Egypt, Louis set his sights on North Africa, on the city of Tunis. Why Tunis? Some say Louis hoped to convert its ruler. Others claim it was a strategic step, a gateway into the Muslim world, from which Egypt and Jerusalem could later fall. The Crusader fleet set sail once more. Hundreds of ships filled the Mediterranean, carrying knights, priests, banners, and hope. They landed on the shores of Tunis, but the blazing African sun was merciless. The Crusaders struggled against the heat. Their supplies ran thin, and disease began to spread. Louis's army camped outside the city, waiting for reinforcements. But instead of glory, they found misery. Dysentery swept through the ranks. Knights and soldiers fell in the dust. The Crusader camp became a place of suffering. And then tragedy struck. King Louis himself fell ill. The pious king, the saintly Crusader, now lay dying on foreign soil. On August 25th, 1270, Louis the Ninth of France breathed his last, whispering prayers with his final breath. The Crusader army, broken and leaderless, lost its will to fight. Negotiations were made. A fragile truce was signed. And the Eighth Crusade ended in failure. For Europe, it was a crushing blow. The death of its greatest Crusader king marked the twilight of the crusading dream. In time, Louis was canonized as a saint, remembered for his faith and devotion. But his crusades brought no lasting victory. The sands of Tunis became the grave of his holy ambition, and the Eighth Crusade faded into history. The year was 1271. The Holy Land trembled once more as a young prince from England, named Edward of Westminster, later to be Edward I, the Longshanks, set sail for Acre. Unlike the vast armies of earlier crusades, this expedition was small. No grand fleets, no massive waves of knights, but rather a modest force, driven by determination. Edward's goal was simple: to strike fear into the heart of the Mamluks and keep the last Crusader strongholds alive. The city of Acre stood as the final jewel of the Latin East, a fragile outpost, surrounded by powerful enemies. Edward landed and began his campaign. He launched raids deep into enemy territory. His forces struck swiftly, burning villages, clashing with the Mamluk armies, and sending ripples of alarm through the region. But the might of the Mamluks was too great to challenge directly. Edward's raids brought temporary victories, but no lasting security. Then, darkness fell over the Crusader camp. An assassin, a follower of the fabled Assassin's Order, slipped into Edward's quarters with a poisoned dagger. The prince fought back. He killed the attacker, but not before suffering a deep wound. For days, he lingered between life and death. His men feared the end of their leader. Miraculously, Edward survived. But his crusade had already begun to falter. Political troubles in England called him home, and the support from Europe dwindled. Without reinforcements, the Ninth Crusade came to an end. It was the last major crusading effort, the final gasp of a dream born nearly 2 centuries before. By 1291, Acre itself would fall. and with it, the Crusader states would vanish. The Ninth Crusade marked the closing chapter of Christendom's great holy wars in the East, and Edward, though remembered as a king of England, would forever carry the memory of the last crusade. The year was 1291. The Mediterranean wind carried whispers of doom, for in the east, the last great citadel of Christendom stood trembling. The city of Acre, a fortress of stone, a beacon of the Crusades, now faced its final trial. For decades, the Crusader states had withered, one by one. Castles had fallen. Cities had been reclaimed by the Muslims, and only Acre, the jewel of the Levant, remained in Latin hands. But the Mamluks, the mighty rulers of Egypt, led by Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, would not rest until every trace of the Crusaders was erased from the Holy Land. Their armies marched, tens of thousands of soldiers, siege engines rumbling, battering rams prepared, the horizon dark with banners, as the Muslim host encircled Acre. Inside the city walls, panic spread. Merchants gathered treasures. Knights polished swords. Women and children prayed in churches, knowing the storm was at hand. The Knights Templar and the Hospitallers stood shoulder to shoulder, unyielding, vowing to defend the cross to the very end. The siege began. Stones from trebuchets crashed into the walls. Flaming arrows lit the night sky. The earth shook with the thunder of war. For weeks, the defenders resisted. Every breach was sealed. Every tower defended. Blood soaked the ramparts as the Mamluks pressed harder. But the enemy was relentless. Day after day, the walls crumbled. Hope grew thin, and despair took root. On May 18th, the final assault came. The Mamluks surged forward, wave after wave, breaking through the shattered gates, flooding into the streets. The defenders fought fiercely. Templars held their ground. Hospitallers swung their blades. The people cried out in terror. But the tide could not be stopped. Temples burned. Markets collapsed. Blood ran through the alleys as the banner of the cross was torn down and the crescent rose. The last knights gathered in the great Templar fortress, fighting until the walls themselves collapsed, their sacrifice echoing through history. By nightfall, Acre was lost, the final stronghold of the Crusaders in the Holy Land had fallen. The dream of the Crusader states, born in fire 2 centuries before, ended in ashes. Christendom wept. Kings of Europe lamented, but none could return. None could raise another crusade. The fall of Acre was not just the end of a city. It was the end of an era. The closing of the age of Crusades. From that day, the Holy Land would remain under Muslim rule, and the cross would never again fly over its ramparts. The Crusades had ended. The banners of the cross no longer flew over Jerusalem. The last citadel of Acre had crumbled into dust. And yet, the story did not end there. For the echoes of the Crusades would ripple across centuries, shaping kingdoms, influencing empires, and altering the destiny of the world. In Europe, the Crusades had ignited a spark. Knights returned with tales of distant lands. Merchants brought back spices, silk, and wonders. Kings discovered the wealth of trade, and the people glimpsed a wider world beyond their borders. The feudal order would never be the same again. Power shifted. Cities rose. Commerce flourished. And Europe began to awaken, step by step, towards the age of exploration and the dawn of modernity, the clash of faiths between Christian and Muslim left scars but also bridges. For knowledge flowed both ways. Mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy passed from east to west, enriching Europe and fueling the Renaissance. Yet the Crusades also left behind bitterness, division, and centuries of mistrust, a memory of war fought in the name of God that lingers even today. But beyond the battles, beyond the sieges, beyond the blood spilled in the Holy Land, there was a deeper legacy. The Crusades had shown humanity the power of belief, the strength of unity, the dangers of fanaticism, and the enduring struggle between ambition and faith. From the dusty roads of Jerusalem to the shattered walls of Acre. The voices of the past still whisper, knights riding under moonlight, pilgrims singing prayers, kings plotting in their courts, sultans commanding their armies, all shadows, all echoes, still lingering in the corridors of time. And though the Crusades ended, their story was never forgotten. It was written in chronicles, carved in stone, painted in manuscripts, and carried in memory. Even now, when we look back, we do not see only war. We see human dreams, human folly, human courage, and human tragedy. The Crusades were not just a war for a city. They were a mirror, reflecting the heights of faith and the depths of violence. A mirror of humanity itself, ever yearning, ever fighting, ever dreaming. And so, the legacy of the Crusades lives on, not in castles, not in swords, not in broken walls, but in the lessons of history. The echoes still whisper. The stories still breathe. And the memory of that age shall never die.